My name's Lonnie Hinton. I'm with Washington Policy Center's Young Professionals Board. I'm also a lawyer and now an amateur podcast host. And today we're joined by Washington Policy Center's Paul Guppy. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, great to be here.
Paul, can you tell us a little bit about your work with Washington Policy Center and what you do here?
So I am the Vice President for Research, which means I run our entire research program. I've been working with the Washington Policy Center for 20 years now, so quite a while. And our program has 8 policy analysts who work for me and produce the intellectual and educational content of what we do. We are an independent research and educational organization, and I oversee that program, which is the writing, the media that we do, the op-eds, and the publications, and the topics we're going to be talking about today.
Great, thank you. Well, I have to say I was extremely excited when I heard that I got to speak with you today and share a little bit of your story and really your expertise on what's on this year's ballot with all of our listeners. If you are new to Washington Policy Center's On the Go podcast, this is our special monthly feature for young professionals. If you are under 40 and don't belong to WPC's YP group, you better get started now. Washington Policy Center has several membership levels, several of which accommodate young professionals. You will get access to all of our quarterly events, our interesting speakers, all of Washington Policy Center's research online and in hard copy. So make sure to check us out online at washingtonpolicy.org. So this is an exciting time for the Washington Policy Center. We're coming off of our annual dinner event. We had Western Washington's annual dinner event at the Bellevue Hyatt, which featured Ben Carson, Newt Gingrich, and Saul Spady. Huge turnout, way exceeded expectations. Paul, what were some of your favorite takeaways from this year's event?
Well, it was a high-energy event. It was really a lot of fun. We had 1,200 people in the ballroom at the hotel. We had another 300 young professionals kind of down the hall in an associated event. We did have Kimberly Strassel. Ben Carson, it turned out, couldn't make it. This is the risk of inviting a cabinet member to come and speak, because the White House had told all members of the Trump cabinet to stay in Washington, D.C. for that week. So we got a late cancellation, but we had Kimberly Strassel, who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal, came and spoke, and she gave us an update on what's going on with the elections and politics. It was really fascinating. Washington Policy Center is a nonpartisan organization, but we do stay very engaged with what's going on with current issues. So the program was a lot of fun. It was very entertaining. And there was just a huge amount of energy in the room. We also have virtually all generations. So there are very senior people there who have been engaged in public policy for decades. They're all talking to each other. It's like a big reunion. And we have a lot of young people there as well. So it's a great mix, and I think people really had a lot of fun. We do this as an annual event, and everyone said that this is one of the best dinners that we've done.
I agree. I go to a lot of events, and I think this is probably my 5th annual dinner, and I think it was my favorite. Saul spoke to the Young Professionals room, and it was just an electric energy. We really appreciated a lot of the ideas that he brought. They were new ideas. Maybe a couple of them might have made some of you squirm. But if you'd like to hear more from Saul, we are working to get him on our December podcast, so stay tuned for that. In addition, we're keeping a lot of this momentum moving by having more events later this year. One of them is the South Sound Happy Hour. That event will be taking place on Wednesday, November 14th from 6 to 8 p.m., so after work, at Dystopian Brewing Company in Tacoma, Washington. Washington Policy Center is actively working to expand its reach throughout Washington state, so if you live or work in the South Sound, I encourage you to go to this event. It will be featuring Senator Hans Zeiger from the 25th Legislative District on how will November's election results affect legislative priorities for the Senate, as well as Jim Bullinger, president of Patriot Fire, on why free market from a local business perspective. Be sure to register for this event online at washingtonpolicy.org/events. In November, the Young Professionals Board will be interviewing potential new members. So if you are interested in becoming more involved with WPC, or maybe you know someone who would make a great addition to our board, please contact us directly and we will be reaching out to them soon. And then finally, in December, a Christmas party is in the works. So make sure to reach out to us about that if you're interested in joining or have any ideas. If you are starting your workout, go ahead and crank up the intensity, or if you're in your car starting your commute, maybe don't crank up the intensity, but put it on cruise control because we're about to get started. So I think one of the big things that we got coming away from the annual dinner is people still have a question mark over what is Washington Policy Center? You say it's a think tank. I don't know
So
what that
is. Right.
Paul, can you tell us a little bit about Washington Policy Center in terms of its work as a think tank in Washington State?
Right. So we are an independent 50c3 nonprofit organization. So we're like any other civic charitable group. Our specific mission, however, is research and education. So you often hear from people say, I don't know who to believe, these issues are complicated, there's a bill in the legislature, there's an initiative on the ballot, a candidate for governor is talking about certain ideas, and people are looking for an independent way of assessing, first getting informed, and then assessing what policy ideas are good for the people of our state and which ones are harmful. We believe that ideas are essential because they essentially determine what the law and the government is doing that affects all of our lives, whether it's education, the small business climate, taxes, our universities. All of those are affected by public policy, and we do research and commentary in order to develop the best ideas for our state.
Thank you for that. You know, it's interesting as an attorney, I work in the law area and then Paul works in policy. And I think a lot of that crosses over. There's kind of this gray area. And then you can add this third section, which is politics, which is kind of the tug of war between policy and how we effectuate it into law. And Washington, I always joke with my friends, Washington isn't necessarily a blue state. I like to think of it as a purple state, not only because it's the home of the best university in America, the University of Washington, go Dogs, but it's a breeding ground for major companies, major ideas. You think about Bill Gates with Microsoft, making computers accessible to the masses, Howard Schultz and Starbucks, making a cup of coffee kind of like a lifestyle for people, Jeff Bezos with Amazon, revolutionizing the way we shop and get things that we need for our everyday lives. You know, the common denominator for these success stories was that the free market provided these kind of rogue innovators with the space to allow their ideas to meet a need. And I think that's what I love about the Washington Policy Center is the fact that it advocates and educates people about how we can improve their lives through market-driven solutions. So that's one of the main reasons that I'm involved with Washington Policy Center as a young professional member and board member. And I think it's one of the reasons that this organization has really become more popular, at least in the recent years, as seen by the success at the annual dinner, is people are looking for answers. Would you agree with that, Paul?
Absolutely. So we have a great state, obviously, and you're right about the companies and the innovation that have developed here. It's also true that politically, Washington is not as blue as it appears to be. So we do a lot of work in eastern Washington, in smaller communities, and people really want an open and free, low-tax environment where they can pursue their dreams and raise their families, get an education, and build a great life for themselves. So that's true across our entire state. And even though Seattle and the Puget Sound area is perceived as the engine driving our state, and that's certainly true, but even areas like the Walla Walla Valley, where they have developed a world-class wine industry, the southwest coast of our state has ports that are open to Asia and the rest of the world. We have a thriving tourism industry. So it's not just the Seattle high-tech hub, as exciting as that is, but there's also a lot of small manufacturing. There's a lot of trade. Agriculture is a huge part of our state. And what ties all of these together is people want to operate in a governing environment that allows them the freedom to pursue their dreams. And so that's where public policy comes in, to make sure that government is actually working for people and not just erecting barriers that block people from achieving what they want to do.
That's great. And today we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to step away from partisan politics and dig into the policy of some of the initiatives on this year's ballot. So we are going to walk through the 4 statewide initiatives as well as 2 city initiatives, one for Seattle and one for Spokane. Paul obviously has a full breadth of experience on these areas and a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share, especially with our young professional members and voters. And so, Paul, can you walk us through kind of the high points of our first initiative, 940 on police training?
Right. So there are four statewide initiatives this year, and this first one, Initiative 940, would require more sensitivity training by law enforcement, de-escalation tactics, and try to reduce violent interaction with the police. It would also, a little more controversially, lower the standard for suing a police officer who may injure somebody in the course of performing their duty. So this has been a problem in the courts where some people say it should be easier to sue the police. Other people are concerned that the police need to have the support to do their job. So that this initiative would change the standard for convicting a police officer who possibly shot someone or injured somebody in the course of doing their job. It creates what's called a good faith standard, and that is to say, would a reasonable person use force in this case? What the police will say is they are already trained for that, but they don't want to be afraid. They don't want to not act in a dangerous situation because they're worried about being sued later on. So that's the controversy with this initiative. There was some drama in how this got put on the ballot because the legislature tried to change the initiative before it went to the ballot. And the courts put a stop to that immediately. That was earlier in the spring. So regardless of the topic, it was kind of interesting that we've had the direct initiative process in our state for 100 years, and this was one of the first time when the legislature tried to monkey with the initiative. They tried to change the text of it before it went onto the ballot, and the court stepped in immediately and put a stop to that. So the initiative that we are voting on now, that I just described briefly, is the original text that was introduced. So there was quite a fight in the spring over what would actually appear on the ballot.
Interesting. So for our members and voters that are looking at this initiative, what are the game-changing bullet points, would you say?
Great point. The main point is that one I mentioned about lowering the standard for suing the police. So what voters are being asked to do is to make a judgment. Is the current standard that we have now, which basically says that if a police officer is acting in performance of his duty for the public safety, he's protected from lawsuits. That's what we have now. What Initiative 940 would do is essentially lower that standard to what's called a good faith or reasonable person standard. That's a technical term, but what it means is it would be easier to criminally charge a police officer for actions he takes in the performance of his duty.
All right, thank you.
It's a tough question.
Right. Moving on to the second initiative on the ballot, 1631, to impose a state carbon tax on energy use in Washington. Paul, I read a little bit about this initiative, and what really kind of struck me was, number one, it doesn't necessarily apply to individuals and businesses alike. And then number two, is it really a tax? It seems like they're kind of dancing around that issue a little bit.
Well, yeah. So for communication purposes, the sponsors of Initiative 1631 are avoiding the term tax. They want to call it an energy fee. But of course, for all of us who will have to pay it eventually, that doesn't make any difference. So what Washington Policy Center does is cut through these kind of jargon labels and we have a very strong plain English standard when we're explaining these ideas. So all of our policy analysts are required, in fact, and I require it, is that you have to be able to understand whatever idea is being proposed. In the case of Initiative 1631, it is a carbon tax. The way it works is that it would put a tax on the sources of energy, and then, of course, that would be passed on to consumers. So this would be like in your utility bill, when you buy gasoline, any form of using energy, even charging your cell phone, would receive this tax. And so it's expensive. It's $610 million a year in the first year, and it goes on for 10 years and ratchets up every year. So it is a heavy tax. And another controversial thing about it is that the money that would be raised would be spent through a 15-member board, not the legislature. So it would be a special appointed board would be set up. These members are unelected, and they would have the power to spend this money pretty much however they wanted for environmental projects. Our analyst Todd Myers, in reading the initiative, it's like 60 pages, he ferrets out all kinds of details that most people don't know about. One of which is that the members of this board are allowed to give public money to themselves in addition to funding other projects. So that's caused, when we sort of outed that point, it created a lot of concern about insider dealing and special interests influencing how 1631 would be administered going into the future. So there's not only the burden of the tax, but there's also the worry about how the money would be spent.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. Initially, when I read, carbon tax, I thought, wow, that really makes sense to me. Of course, we want to protect the environment. Mm-hmm. We need to incentivize people to do that. We want innovators moving towards greener technologies. But when I really read through this initiative, it didn't seem like there were metrics in place if it was passed into law that would make sure that that actually effectuate change in a positive direction. Did you feel that way when you read it?
Absolutely. There's essentially no accountability because this 15-member board has total control over setting the metrics. I mean, they're listed in the initiative, but the board can change the metrics whenever they like, number one. And number two, they are the ones who determine whether they're meeting the metrics or not. And then another mechanism that Todd discovered is that the tax doesn't go down unless or until the state as a whole is meeting carbon reduction metrics. But of course the board, which controls the money, would have no incentive to see their own revenue go down. So what Todd thinks is that we would never meet these targets, and there's really no way to create accountability.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I would probably steer away from voting for this initiative, at least personally. But I think moving forward, this is definitely an area that there's room to grow.
Right.
What are things that you would look for in maybe a future initiative that you think would be really, impactful?
Great point. So, as a free market organization, our concern is that this cuts out consumers altogether. It's an effort to reduce carbon by punishing people by increasing the cost of all energy use. What Todd has found out is that there's a completely different track going on even as we speak. He calls it cell phone environmentalism because there are so many apps that allow people to both see and control how much energy they're using, whether it's in their homes or cars or different devices. And that allows the consumer to go back to the utility company and say, I want more green energy. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for green energy. Utilities do that now, and we think that's the approach that should be encouraged. It allows people to make individual decisions in their lives to, even if they want to pay a little bit more, in order to move towards renewable energies. And we think that creates the market response that gets producers to respond to that.
All right, moving on to our third initiative, Initiative 1634, a ban on discriminatory local taxes on local food items. I have to say, I laughed a little bit when I saw this one on the ballot because I think everyone remembers seeing Seattle's, they called it kind of like the soda tax or the drinks tax. If you remember going through Costco and buying a package of Gatorade for $8 and then you go back the next week and it's $20. I think people had some sticker shock there. Paul, can you tell us a little bit about this initiative?
Yeah, it's just that simple. And this is where life as an analyst gets to be kind of fun because Jason Mercier, who's our budget expert, he already knows this topic backwards and forwards, but he read the initiative, which probably took him 5 minutes, and he quickly determined that this is an anti-soda tax initiative. So it's completely prompted by the experience in Seattle. This initiative does not repeal the tax in Seattle, but what it does is set a provision in law that says that no local jurisdiction, county, city, can impose its own tax on food items. So this is groceries that you buy at the store. And it's very straightforward. Washington State also has a tradition that goes back to the early 80s of not taxing food and not taxing prescription medicines. So our biggest concern about the soda tax in Seattle was that it was eroding away this principle, even though soda is not good for you, okay, it's kind of like a sin tax. But our concern was, well, you're starting down that list of things which the government is saying are not good for you, and they're starting to tax food. And it was that policy principle that we wanted to preserve in our state. Other states they have a sales tax on grocery, fine for them. But one principle in our state is that essential things for your life, like prescription medicine and groceries, should not be subject to the sales tax. And that's what 1634 does.
I think that's a good point. And I like that you highlighted that this only applies kind of on the local city level. It's not the state level, so it's more limited in scope.
It is, and now the state doesn't tax groceries either, which is good. But at the state level, that is a policy that is determined by the legislature, and they are responsive to the voters. So we're not so concerned. We know, we track the legislature very closely. One of our tests is this vote a career-ending vote for some state lawmaker? And the answer is, if you try to tax groceries, you will probably no longer be a state legislator. And so we like that response from the public. The same is true of a state income tax. It doesn't matter how many official rules that you write down. What really gets government's attention is if they feel they're going to lose votes. And so that's the best safeguard that we have.
Agreed. On to our fourth initiative, Initiative 1639 on firearms regulation. When I read this one, it came off as a little bit complicated and very controversial. Paul,
Yes.
What did you think of it?
It is super controversial. It also has many moving parts. So unlike the grocery one that we just discussed, it took quite a while to figure out exactly. You have to sit down and diagram out exactly what provisions and what it would do. So 1639 has several moving parts, but they all move in the direction of restricting firearms ownership. So it's presented as a public safety measure, but it's entirely targeted towards people who either someday want to purchase a firearm or who legally own a firearm. It is not targeted towards lawbreakers, and that is the main objection that we're hearing from the gun rights groups, is that ordinary citizens going about their business, if they have a firearm at home, they would be subject to this initiative, and that worries people. Also, we mentioned different communities across the state. So while in the Seattle area, firearms ownership is not a big deal, but across eastern Washington and the southern part of the state, it's just a normal part of life for where a lot of people live. Getting down to the details, what Initiative 1639 would do is declare that virtually every rifle in the state is a quote assault weapon. So assault weapon is not a legal defined term. It's just a phrase. So commonly owned hunting guns, shotguns, things that people have had for years, the firearm you inherited from your grandfather would be labeled as an assault weapon under this initiative. So we're not talking about just military-style weapons. The other part of it that's controversial is about requiring that firearms be locked up, be secured. Every firearms course teaches this. This is just a basic safety thing. It's the same for firearms owners. This is the same common sense that you use with your car. Cars can be dangerous, so you need to handle them safely. Legal gun owners feel the same way about their firearms. Keep them secure, keep them locked up. What Initiative 1639 does is criminalize a person whose firearm is stolen and then used by somebody else in a crime. That is probably the greatest worry in 1639. So it creates a new crime in state law called community endangerment. And what that means is that if you have a firearm at home, even if you have it locked up, somebody breaks in, steals the firearm, and then goes and uses it later in a crime, the original owner can be held liable for that to some degree, like up to a year in prison. There are provisions in the initiative that say that if the firearm was secured properly, then you're immune from that prosecution. But it's not exactly clear what, and I read the thing carefully. I did this analysis. So I'm reading through it, and I'm thinking like, okay, if I have a gun at home for home defense, what does locked up mean? It's locked in my house. Maybe I have it locked in a gun safe. You can have a trigger lock. You can have a cabinet. But the initiative doesn't make it clear what secure means. So the biggest objection we've heard from, again, gun owner groups is they don't know whether they've complied with the law or not, or you might get in trouble in the future because your firearms were stolen and then used by somebody else.
Wow, great points. It's interesting. I'm from a more rural area
Yeah.
where guns are really seen as tools and people
Right.
have a really healthy respect for them. But with that respect comes a lot of experience because you're with them all the time. Duck hunting, being out on major pieces of
Exactly.
property where you need to protect yourself. So it'll be interesting to see if this is actually put into law, how they'll be able to carry it out, especially in the more agricultural areas of Washington.
I definitely got the sense that the people who wrote this initiative are not very familiar with sort of gun culture. So, and I don't mean that people in rural areas are crazy about guns, but as you pointed out, it's just a tool that they have around. And there's a common sense idea that they are dangerous and you need to be careful. And these are taught universally. And again, it's no different than someone who lives in an urban environment who has something dangerous around. We all know what that is. And then the second group, which I think the initiative sponsors might not be aware of, is there are a lot of urban people who would never publicly say that they have a firearm, okay? But they live alone or they have family members that they want to protect. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of people who live in cities who have usually one firearm in their home, maybe in their car, maybe they have a concealed carry permit. They do not advertise this. They do not think of themselves as Second Amendment people, but it's a little bit like safety insurance. They just want to have a way at home for self-defense. And that is the main objection to 1639, is that it makes self-defense harder.
Mm-hmm. All good points. Okay, now moving on to our two city-specific issues. We have Seattle's 2018 Family and Education Levy. Paul, when I read through this, it hit me as kind of like a secret property tax or something like, okay, if I'm renting, maybe it's going to be folded into my rent. If I own a condominium, it's going to be rolled into my HOA dues. How are they sneaking this in? And they're doubling what was there before.
So this is kind of sneaky because the Families and Education Levy is a city tax that goes to the schools. So that is very unusual across America. We only know of one or two other examples of cities that impose a special property tax, which is then used to pay for education programs. Because as you know, in Seattle, we have a school district, we have school levies. The schools in Seattle receive state money already from Olympia, and this city Families and Education Levy is on top of all of that. So Seattle already spends $18,000 per student in the regular schools. This special property tax, as I said, is in addition to that. It's a doubling of the previous levy. So this levy has been in place since the early 1990s, and it's usually for 6 or 7 years, and then it's renewed. So we are up for renewal. It's passed by the voters every time. And in this case, they're doubling the amount of the tax to $636 million, which that number doesn't mean much to people, but it adds about $250 or $300 to the cost of the property taxes that people are paying. The other principle in economics, which most people don't notice, is that everybody pays property taxes because property taxes makes everything more expensive. Even a nonprofit like the Washington Policy Center, when we're dealing in the economy, every transaction that we do with another contractor or another group has the property tax built into it. So, for example, you were mentioning our dinner. Okay, well, we held it at the Hyatt Hotel. The Hyatt Hotel has to pay property taxes. So that makes putting on our dinner more expensive, just as an example. And you mentioned renters and people who pay homeowner dues and things like that. So we think of the property tax as being particularly burdensome and regressive because it falls hardest on low-income households, even if they pay rent. Whereas wealthy people, as you know, they don't particularly notice if their taxes go up. But it's middle-income and low-income people that get hit the hardest, single people. And it always makes me kind of laugh because separately, I'll see some city council member bemoaning the fact that housing is so expensive in Seattle, okay, that we have so many homeless, that Seattle is such an expensive place to live. And I feel like, sort of tapping that person on the shoulder and saying, well, you keep increasing the property tax. Mm-hmm. And this levy is an example of that.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing that stood out to me on this one in particular was, okay, it's great, we're putting more money towards education, but what are the results? I
Yeah,
know a
not
lot of
great.
millennials listening now probably remember the standardized test, the WASL,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a new standardized test now. But since this levy was enacted and now it's up again, there hasn't been a dramatic increase in the quality of education that our students are receiving.
Right. So that's a separate problem. So again, as an independent analyst, we ask exactly that question. The presumption of the people who are promoting the levy is, well, this is going to help kids. And so, well, okay, we're all for that. Can you show us how that does it? Especially since the levy has been in place for 28 years. So our question is, are graduation rates better? Are reading and math scores better? You mentioned the WASL, which was around for years, and then it was canceled. So our question is, if these programs are so great, how come they haven't produced better results? The other comparison we make is the spending that's done through online education or private schools or charter schools, which all spend much less money than $18,000 a year and produce better results. And we looked into why that is. And the answer is that when families have greater flexibility and choice, obviously someone who's going to a private school, the family is very engaged, they're able to pay for that, great for them. But even with online schools and charter schools, which are part of public education, when there's more choice and engagement by the family, the education is much more effective for the child. The families and education levy through the city, we found, just gets poured into the bureaucracy. They spend it, definitely. I mean, they spend over $900 million a year in Seattle schools, but they don't always produce good results out of the other end.
Mm-hmm.
What's scandalous for us is that some schools in South Seattle have a 50% dropout rate. So
Unbelievable. Really, that should
exactly.
be unacceptable.
And yet they get more money. So we definitely promote alternatives that allow families to choose a different way to educate their kids rather than just increasing taxes and adding more money.
Okay, now for our last item on the ballot affecting Spokane voters, Spokane Public Schools Prop 1. Can you just briefly take us through this one, Paul?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. It's a straightforward libraries and school bond issue. The thing is that Spokane schools, rather, has already been spending money on new schools. So there's a real question as to whether these facilities are really needed. In the case of libraries, in today's modern world, municipal libraries are finding that attendance is dropping. There's just less need for them. When you have instant access to the internet, when everyone carries around in their pocket the equivalent of the Library of Congress, okay, there's just naturally, I think we're entering an era when, the bricks and mortar building filled books that you walked into, the public library, is just less needed. And so the attendance numbers have been dropping. And so people in Spokane are raising the question, why are we raising taxes to pay for a public service that's not as needed as it was in the past?
Agreed. All right. Well, thank you, Paul, for sharing with us about these different initiatives and propositions. And now I'd like to take a step away from policy, so we aren't allowed to say the P word anymore. I would love for our listeners to learn a little bit more about you. You have a tremendous career in policy, starting out in Washington, going over to Washington, D.C., working on the Hill for several years, and then coming back to join the Washington Policy Center. But you as a person, I think that's what young professionals are interested in learning about. Just quickly, what's a habit that you think has made you successful in your career?
Okay, a habit. Well, this might sound obvious, but I love to read. So I don't know, if I had any advice to a person starting out in their career would be get into the habit of reading every day. Read things that are interesting, so it doesn't have to be labor, but particularly with, people look at their phones all the time, they're online. That's all great. But sitting down and reading an article or a book or something that you just find to be interesting is just a really good habit for strengthening your mind.
What book is on your nightstand right now?
Oh, my goodness. Okay, I just finished a book about Socrates. Okay,
Ooh.
so that was just a little philosophical summary. It was short. And I just started reading a novel, a classic, which is The House of the Seven Gables by Hawthorne.
Okay.
But the reason I'm giving that as an example is that it's a case where you say to yourself, like, look, I'm just not going to be busy for a few minutes. I'm just going to sit here, read a book that I enjoy, just let the language flow, kind of get engaged with it. And because that greatly increases your skill in reading and writing, it expands your vocabulary, and it also makes you an interesting person. But for people who are looking for professional advice, I always say, try to read some articles or books. And then the last tip I'll give, is I print out articles on the internet instead of reading them on the screen, just to get away from the screen. So,
agreed.
Yeah.
I
So
totally agree with
when
that.
you're reading the printed page, it's just a lot more relaxing.
All right, second one. Can you
Okay.
share with us both a high and a low from your career?
Well, the high was probably when I got hired in my first job in Congress, which was a low-level staff position. I was legislative correspondent, which is a fancy word for the guy who handles the mail. And this was back in the 80s when, of course, members of Congress still get hundreds or thousands.
When they got mail, now
when
they get
got
email.
Mail,
there we go.
Now they get email and electronic contacts. But the thing is, the job for the staff is the same, which is the member of Congress is going to be responsive to constituents and answer their questions. So they need staff members to prepare, comments on different issues. The congressman I worked for, who was a great guy, he was decisive and clear about his positions, which made my job very easy. So when we got questions from constituents about different issues, he had already explained to us what his position was, and all we had to do was write it up in a couple of paragraphs. So it was really exciting when I got that first job. The low point was when I got fired by the voters twice. So the risk of working in public policy is your boss might fail to get elected. So that's what happened. I worked for a member of Congress who was defeated for his reelection. And then I worked in the first Bush administration, believe it or not, way back. And as we all know, George Bush did not get reelected in 1992.
The first Bush,
The
for
first
everyone
George
listening.
Bush, back what for me would be earlier in my work life. So what I'm saying is that the interesting thing about that field is you wake up the next day after Election Day and you are unemployed. The good news, and I was a staff member, so the good news is that there's a whole 2 months of transition between Election Day and when your paycheck stops. So that gives you a chance to transition into other work, which is what I did.
Okay, great. We had a lot of fun the other day at the Washington Athletic Club. The Young Professionals Board hosted some of the executive board members of our college clubs at the University of Washington and Seattle University. It was great to meet with them, and when I was speaking with them, a lot of them said, "Oh my gosh, Lonnie, I'd love to be a lawyer. I want to go intern on the Hill. I want to move down to Olympia and work as a legislative assistant." Paul, if you were talking to anyone who is interested in going into a career in policy or law, what's some advice that you would give them today?
Yeah, I would say anything to get your foot in the door and get experience and be able to kind of prove yourself. So obviously there are things like internships. Sometimes they're unpaid. So the hard part is how to support yourself while getting work experience at the same time. So you have to strike that balance. But as far as contacts go, I would say any kind of work that gets you engaged in the field that you're interested in. At our dinner, we had a number of volunteers who just worked that one night, but it kind of gave them an introduction into what a think tank does. I mentioned the legislative correspondence job I had. Well, I had 2 master's degrees in public policy, but you can't go around with a big head and say, I won't take that job, it's not good enough for me. You have to get something that gets you started. And then the second piece of advice I would give is just networking, any kind of contacts. And of course, Young Professionals is a great way to do that.
So join Washington
there you
Policy
go.
Center Young Professionals.
But really networking, because even in the electronic age, face-to-face conversations, just getting to know people, introducing yourself. And this can be very casual. I know some people are shy, but at the YP events, they are very relaxing and low-key. Often our board members go to these events, so these are successful professional people who are always happy to talk to somebody younger. But the main thing, whether it's Young Professionals or some other group, anything that kind of gets you casually connected with people that work in the area that you're interested in, you will pick up a huge amount of information and a really good perspective on what that career is like. When I worked on Capitol Hill, because Congress is all forced to be in the same group of buildings. It's like a big college campus. That's where I learned a lot about my work, was just networking around. I actually, with a couple of friends, we started a group called the Sunday Brunch Group. I'll just put it that way. So every Sunday we got together for brunch. This group was like 30 people, and they all worked in Senate and congressional offices, or they worked in the White House or the administration, and it was just a way to, to get to know people. So I would encourage the same thing for any kind of social event that just helps you get connected.
All right. Well, you heard it from Paul. Go to Sunday Brunch.
That's right.
Again, this is a reminder to attend the South Sound Happy Hour on November 14th, and that the deadline to vote is November 6th. So make sure to vote, put it in the mailbox, do whatever you need to do to have your voice heard. Thank you so much for joining us on today's version of On the Go, the Young Professionals edition. We will see you next time. Thank you.